Welcome to this short video explaining how to get full marks on your recent end of unit test on the coast part. Now before we go any further, it's probably worth thinking about how you're going to use this video. The best way of using this video as we go through each question is listen to the advice, have a look at the question, look at the feedback that there is, look at the mark scheme, and once you're actually sure what you need to do to improve your answer, press pause. Have a go at writing your question. If you're still not sure, come back. The great thing about using a video is that you can actually come back, look at the bit again, and keep playing it till you are sure. Once you are sure, check that you've actually now got full marks on your answers, move on to the next one. So, without further ado, let's have a look at the first few questions. Okay, so the first question was getting you to look at the OS map. Now, this isn't an exact copy of the map you were using. It's not. The one you were using was a little bit easier, it had the grid squares a bit clearer, but it's good enough for our purposes. Right, so let's have a look at the first question. So the first question here asks us to look at 8612. Now remember that with four-figure grid references you're always using the bottom left-hand corner of the grid, and if we have a look we can see 86 is, let's have a look, 86 is here, and 12 is here, and if we put the two together we get into this area here. So we can see a sort of yellowy creamy colour with some dots in. Now if you have a look, once you've actually spotted what you've actually got there, look at your key and what you will see is that that is a shingle. So that's either right or wrong. It's a question of actually looking and seeing what it is in the key. That's all it's testing here. The second question requires you to actually look at the map, use contour lines, use spot heights, etc., and actually have a look and see if you can understand what's going on. So the second one asks you to look for 9209. So again, looking for 92, there it is. 09 is here. So the bottom right hand corner is here, so it's this grid square here. Now, this is a little bit tricky because there isn't necessarily one correct answer. We do know, because we can see just here, there's a spot height. So we know that the lowest answer to this can be 93 metres. Now, two ways of finding out heights on an OS map. One, spot heights, so again that's our 93 there. The other one is contour lines. Now if we look carefully, what we can see is that here there's a 90 metre contour line. Contour lines go every 10 metres. So if it gets higher, eventually when it gets to 100 metres there'll be another contour line. Now what we can see is that in this square here there isn't a 100 metre contour line. So the highest point has to be somewhere between 93 or 99. It cannot be 100 metres. So anywhere between 93 and 100 metres would be fine. In fact, if you have a look, amazingly, the exam board actually reckons 93 to 109, but I think that's actually a mistake. If you have a look here, it does say not 100 metres plus. So I think really what they're looking for is 93 to 99. To be honest, given that spot heights generally are taken from the highest point in an area, chances are the answer is 93. But anything 93 to 99 should get you the mark. Right, next question. Again, quite a hard one this for 1 mark. It wants you to compare 9209, which is the one we were just looking at, with 9210, this one just to the north of it here. And the question is saying, use map evidence to compare the slope, basically how steep the land is in those two squares. Okay, again, this is about using contour lines. Now, the last one was really using spot heights, this one's contour lines. If we have a look here, what you can see is in this one square, there is just a one contour line. When we come over here, what we can see is that there's a 90 metre, there's an 80, there's a 70, there's a 60, and I assume there's a 50 all the way down to the coast where it'll be 0. So actually there's 9 contour lines, 90 metres change in height. Over here there was 1, no more than 10. So we can tell, because there's far more contour lines and the contour lines are closer together, that this grid square is steeper. In fact, if you have a look, really all you need to write, and the answer's here, is that 9210 is steeper than 9209. One word of warning, there must be some comparison here. If you just write in 9210 steep, it's not a comparison, you won't get a mark. Okay? Whenever you see this word compare, you have to have a comparison. You have to say this is steeper than this is higher than this is bigger than this. So it's just something to be aware of. Right, so if you're happy with those questions, have a go at them. Okay, when you think you've got full marks, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we now come on to the next question, which is asking you to look at this particular photo. Now, one of the problems with this question is if you look at it, it says give two pieces of evidence. That's fairly straightforward, I understand what that means, which shows that erosion has taken place there. Now, a lot of people look at that and they think, oh, I haven't got a clue what the hell this means. What do they mean shows erosion? Actually, what it's really asking you to do is name two erosional landforms. And if you look at the picture, you'll actually see there's quite a few. First of all, if you have a look here, you've got a cliff. It's an erosional landform. The most obvious thing you've got really here is that stack. You might even call it a stump, it's so small. You've got another stack over in the background. You've got what looks like a headland. You've got evidence that there's a bay that's formed. And probably the one you're least likely to put down, but actually makes up the biggest area, is this flat area of rock, which is called a wave-cut platform. So any two erosional landforms would get you your mark here. And if we have a look, what we can do is we can have a look at the mark scheme, and it literally is that simple. One mark for stack or stump, one mark for cliff, one for headland and bay, one for wave cut platform, one's for rocky beach. So once you actually understand the question, very simple. It's understanding the question on this one, which is the challenge. Okay, now, when we come to the next question, it's a name and describe question. Now, 4 marks is asking for 2 processes. So if you think about it, understanding the mark scheme should be pretty straightforward. 4 marks, 2 processes, name, describe. And if you look, what you'll actually see is exactly what the mark scheme is asking for. There's 1 mark for each name, there's 1 mark for each description. So it really is just basically saying, picking 2 types of erosion and explaining how each one works. So it could be hydraulic action. This is interesting. It's using the more sort of detailed definition of hydraulic action, which is probably appropriate for a higher tier paper. So it's asking for waves forcing air into cracks, the force of the water widening the cracks. If you're talking about abrasion, then it's when the waves are throwing materials against the cliff, grinding or rubbing the sediment against the cliff. Attrition, the banging of sand and particles together, making them rounder and smaller. And finally, solution, the dissolved material, particularly limestone, by the sea. 1 mark for the name, 1 mark for the correct explanation. So make sure you've got those. Okay, now there's no marks here for weathering. It's completely different. That's the breakdown of rocks in situation. There's no marks here for talking about the formation of stacks and arches and collapses or that things, or even undercutting. When they're talking about processes of erosion, they really are talking about these 4 things. So make sure you know them, make sure you got it, make sure you got full marks. Okay, now we move on to question C. This is a really interesting one, and again, it's quite a tough one for 4 marks if you don't unpick what is after. So look at the question. First thing you see says explain. Explain means, normally you're going to use because. It certainly means you're going to develop your answers. Okay, and if you have a look, geology, so it's talking about rocks, rock types, features in rocks, affects the formation of coastal landforms. Again, trying to unpick this. This means tell me something about geology and explain how it's going to cause a coastal landform. Once you've sort of unpicked the question, it suddenly becomes a bit easier. Okay, let's have a think about geology. Well, first of all, you could be talking about hard rocks, resistant rocks, and less hard rocks, softer rocks, easily eroded rocks. And if you talk about that, you're going to get 1 mark. If you can then explain what that's going to form. So for example, if we have a look over here on the map of the Purbeck, we can see where there's limestone, chalk even, and where there's limestone, you've got headlands, and on those headlands, because it's more resistant, they stick out into the sea, and also along here, this is where your stacks, your arches, your stumps, etc. are going to form. So, if we're talking about hard rocks, being more resistant, 1 mark, forming stack stumps, arches, 2nd mark. We could talk about soft rock. We could talk about soft rock, clays for example, easily eroded, forming bays, cliffs rapidly eroding from slumping and easily erosion. Again, 1 mark for soft rock, easily eroded, forming bays. It could be you talk about alternating layers of hard and soft rocks like we've got here. Alternating hard and soft rocks forming a discordant coastline. That would be fine. On the other hand, you could talk about when you have 1 layer of rock forming a concordant coastline like we have along this coastline. You might also want to talk about the actual rocks themselves and features in the rocks. So, for example, have a look at the photo that we have here, and what you can actually see is there's a large joint that's formed. And because that joint has formed and it's an area of weakness, you've then got, you can see it forming here, a cave. Other things you might want to consider is, for example, limestones. Where you've got limestones, they might erode faster because they can be dissolved by the sea to form solution. So make sure for this one you've got 1 point, okay, such as hard rocks, slow to erode, form headlands, and then 1 point which is the development, okay, which is what does that hard rock form. Pretty tough one this. Once you unpick the question though, you should be fine. Have a go at it, and again, when you're comfortable you've got 4 marks, then go on to the next one. Okay, question D. Again, this is one of those questions, once you understand, is pretty straightforward. The first thing you've got to do is get your head around what it's asking. And part of the problem with this is it's asking such a broad question. There's 2 or 3 different ways of actually answering it. Right, if you have a look, what you'll see is that there's sort of 2 or 3 ways examples are expecting you to do it. The first one, which gets you a point, is talking about erosion. So if you talk about the sand is eroded from the cliffs by hydraulic action or something like that, there's 1 or 2 marks there at most. Then, basically, you've got 2 options, and I've included 2 diagrams here that you might want to use. You might want to talk about constructive waves. Again, you're going to get 1 mark for talking about strong swash, or swash being more powerful than the backwash. Another mark may be saying that the swash pushes material up at the beach, and depending on how much you develop that, there's probably 2, 3 or even 4 marks there. Throw in 1 for erosion, producing the sediment, and you've got your 4 marks. Actually, for me, the easier one is this diagram here, explaining longshore drift. So again, you might get 1 mark for starting off talking about where the beach material comes from, the eroded cliffs. 1 mark for talking about the direction of prevailing wind. 1 mark for talking about the swash moving material up the beach. 1 mark for the backwash moving it down due to the force of gravity. 1 mark for it moving along the shore by longshore drift. You may also want to think about the fact that on the map you can see there's a pier there that acts as a groin. So again, there's another mark there if you talk about the formation of a groin. Once you understand this is a tell me about how beaches form because of constructive waves, or tell me how beaches form because of longshore drift, it's much easier. The only thing you've got to decide is, will you actually use the diagram or will you actually use text? If you're going to use the diagram, then I strongly suggest that what you do is you make sure you actually fully label it. And I would say actually that these labels here aren't quite detailed enough if you're doing that route. If you're not going to produce a detailed label, then use the text. Okay, now we come on to the final 12-mark question. Now, it's worth remembering it's 12 marks, it's over 1/3 of all the marks in the exam. So we've got to get these right. Now, to get them right, it's really important that what we can do is we can unpick the question. So have a think about what you're actually being asked to do. So first of all, you're asked to actually name an area. The best answers are going to say the Holderness coastline, and they're going to name the village of Appleton. Right. Secondly, you'll always be asked to do 2 things. It's normally describe and then explain. Sometimes it's explain and explain, but it's always 2 things. So make sure you know exactly what you're doing. If you don't get that both parts done well, you're going to struggle to get beyond half mark. So we want to make sure we've got both parts. The other thing is this number 3. The rule of 3 is really important. You need 3 developed ideas. Looking at the exam mark scheme, looking at the examiner's feedback, they particularly felt the best answers had 3 management strategies, 3 ways the coast was managed, and 3 reasons why it was sustainable. So, if that's what examiners reckon the best ones are, let's try and aim for that. So let's have a think about management techniques. There are 3 management techniques which are worth mentioning. First of all, you've got the large rock armour groins. So these were massive groins built of rock armour, each one about 7 tonnes, each rock 7 tonnes, and basically that then was trapping sand moved south by longshore drift. Really important, builds up a beach, the beach then absorbs the energy of the waves, reduces the erosion. But that is going to reduce the amount of sand moving southwards, and we'll talk about that later. Secondly, you've got a rock armour wall at the base of the cliffs. That's there to do 2 things. One, that's there designed to stop the sea from actually hitting the base of the cliff, and it's also there to act support to the base of the cliff to stop it slumping. And because this cliff is made of such soft material, it's made of a material called boulder clay, which is one of the weakest rocks imaginable, they've also regraded the cliff. What that means is that instead of having a steep cliff, they've actually deliberately taken the top of the cliff off to make it a much shallower cliff, so it's less likely to collapse. So the best answers would have each of these things, would have some specific facts, maybe talk about how much it costs, maybe talk about the length of rock armour, would talk about perhaps how cliff regrading helped them allow plant vegetation to make it more stable. But there'd certainly be, this is what they've done, this is why it works, this is how it works. That probably is a fairly big first paragraph. You then want to think about how sustainable they are. Now let's remember what sustainable means. Sustainable means that, well, the technical definition is development that meets the needs of today without harming the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But in plain English, good in the short term, good in the long term. So, what can we see? Why is this good in the short term, good in the long term? Well, first of all, yes, it is sustainable because it was cheaper than having to rebuild the main road that ran through the village. You're saving money. That's got to be a good thing. That means you don't have to rebuild the road, you have no problems with the road falling in and transport links being broken, you haven't got to pay for the cost and borrow the money to build for the road. It's got to be good in the short and the long term. It's got to be good for those people that live there. Their houses are being protected, people not forced to leave. That's got to be good, rather than people having to be relocated, or for people to have to have insurance, or for the council to have to pay for that. The actual defences themselves, they chose rock armour rather than sea walls because it's cheap. Okay, it's going to last a number of years, and the other nice thing about rock armour is that when it finally gets broken down by the sea, which all sea defences will, it forms sand. There's no pollution here. So that again means it's not causing any problems in the long term. However, there is a problem, and pardon me for my typo there, this is going to create terminal groin syndrome. And terminal groin syndrome is what happens after the last groin. So there's a massive increase in erosion downdrift. That's going to cause massive increases in erosion, and we saw in places like Sewell's Farm, which is about half a mile south of this place, there was a 10-fold increase in erosion. It had gone from 1 to 2 metres a year to 20 metres a year. So that's unsustainable. That's actually damaging that land, destroying, increasing erosion. That's not good in the short or the long term, particularly for that farmer. You could argue, however, that actually, although it's not ideal, it is low-value land, and actually, although it's not good, particularly for Sewell and her farm, actually it's a price worth paying, and that the cost there isn't anywhere as expensive as having to relocate a whole village and rebuild that road. Okay, I hope you found this useful. Hopefully by now you should be in a position to finish this final question, and your job is to make sure that you have now got, with your purple pen work, an entire exam question totally and utterly finished, totally perfect. If you're not sure, stop the video, go back, make sure you have. Okay, so good luck, and we'll be interested to see what your work's like at the end.